Hello, my pretties. My name is Scarin. I wish I had been doing that all month. But I read books. This month was October, and as expected, I read a lot of horror. I read some highly anticipated reads. I read some surprising new favorites. I read my least favorite book I've ever read in my entire life. It's been quite the ride, quite the journey. I've been watching Treehouse of Horror all morning, so I'm feeling very spooky, in a fantastic mood, and I'm ready to talk books. So let's get into it. The first few books that I read this month were library books, so I'll just pop up some photos. The first one was a graphic novel called Catboy by Benji Nate, and this is not horror at all. I realized that. At the beginning of this month, the autism was really coming for me, and whenever that happens, I get very into middle grade and YA graphic novels because it just soothes my brains. So I picked that one up one night, and I really enjoyed it. It was really cute. It's about a girl who wishes that her best friend, who is a cat, could become a human so they could like talk to each other and hang out better. It was really cute. It's like episodic little silly stories. The best part about it was the fashion. The drawn outfits in that graphic novel were exquisite, and at the beginning of each story they have her and the cat, like the humanoid cat, modeling outfits, and those were weirdly my favorite parts. I just love clothes. But anyway, I don't have a whole lot to say about it. It was a comforting time. It was fun. I enjoyed it. The second book I read was Harvest Home by Thomas Tryon. There's a whole reading vlog for that book and the next three that I'm going to talk about. It was my Over the Garden Wall Pottsfield reading vlog. So you can go there if you want some more information on how I feel about this book. But I hated it with my entire heart. I hated it so profoundly, both on a technical level and on an ideological level. Technically, this book was slow as hell, paced horribly. I have a solid attention span, and this book almost broke me. I hated it so much. The characters, not overly developed. You know, I talk a lot about plot, character, prose, and setting, and which of those is the most important to us, and thus what books will we like the most. And I don't really think that this book hits any of them, except maybe setting. If by setting you're looking for a lot of descriptions of fields and corn, then by all means, read Harvest Home. But the prose are insufferable. The plot is nearly non-existent. Very little happens until the very end, and then it's an ideological mess. And the characters, not overly developed, not overly interesting. And the only one who was developed I hated with my whole entire heart. And so it was a little difficult to give a shit about if anything bad happened to him, because I was actively rooting for it. Ideologically, the horrors of this book are women having power, having a sex drive, caring about the planet. I mean, what's that about, am I right? Yeah, just women and Mother Earth are the bad guys of this book. And the main character is a misogynistic creep. So, yeah, really rooting for the ladies, which is not how you're supposed to feel reading this book, I assume, based on the things that the women are doing, because you know what women do when they have power, am I right? Snip, snip. So, you know, it just wasn't for me. It wasn't for me. I would say if you have the strongest attention span of all time, if you really are passionate about like 60s and 70s American horror, and if you can set aside any modern ideological values that you may hold, or hopefully hold, which I clearly could not do, then you might like Harvest Home, but I certainly wouldn't recommend it to anyone. I know some people like it, and I would love to know why. I would really love to understand what you see in it from a non-judgmental place. I just hated it so much that I have a hard time understanding what other people got out of it. And I would really love to understand that in a kind, you know, mutually respectful kind of way. But it was extremely not for me, and I don't want to talk about it anymore. So I won't. The next two books kind of go together. They are Garlic and the Vampire and Garlic and the Witch by Brie Paulson. This was a very necessary little refresher after what I just talked about. They were just really beautiful. It was about an anxious little garlic, a humanoid garlic bulb, who is tasked with going out to fight the vampire that the other vegetables believe now lives in the castle on the other side of the mountains. They're very scared. They're like, garlic? I mean, right? You're freaking garlic. Go take care of this guy. And so poor anxious little garlic fights through the anxiety and goes and has a very wholesome time with the vampire. Not to spoil anything, but this is a very gentle, very wholesome, very lovely time. I really appreciated what it had to say about anxiety, especially anxiety surrounding change, because that's a very big thing that I struggle with. I highly recommend it, especially if you like cozy, kind of cottagey, witchy, middle grade graphic novels. I think it would be an impeccable time for you. Next up, for that same reading vlog, I read Dark Harvest by Norman Partridge. And it was fine. You know? It was fine. It is very plot focused, which is not my thing. I described it as testosterone-y in that reading vlog, and I think that's kind of the best way to describe it. It is very, like, boys fighting each other, you know, which is, I just don't care. But the synopsis was pretty interesting. It's about the October boy, who is a jack-o'-lantern head and like a cornstalk body. And every Halloween he comes alive, and all of the teenage boys in this town are just put out on their own, out in the darkness to fight the October boy. And whoever can kill him before midnight gets to leave the town, and no one else is ever allowed to leave the town. So the setting was pretty cool. It had really big Ray Bradbury, like Something Wicked This Way Comes vibes, and there was more character development than I was really anticipating. I just still had kind of a hard time like really getting into them, especially because they're all just boys fighting. All that said, if you want like a quick, really Halloween-y, really action-packed, quick read, you might like Dark Harvest. It has a lot of good ratings. I know a lot of people really like it. There was just a movie made of it, I believe this year. So if you're a plot and a spooky setting kind of person, this might work for you. I hope it does. It just didn't so much work for me. Okay, so after that, I was like, okay, what's the opposite of the books that I've just read? And I had just gotten this for my partner in my Hallow stocking, and that is A Witch's Guide to Fake Dating a Demon by Sarah Hawley. And it was indeed the opposite of what I had just read. I shockingly really loved this book. I've said it a million times and I'll say it again. I'm a lesbian, but this is like the first straight romance that I was like, oh, okay. It's not for me, but it's fun to read about. It is about a witch who accidentally summons a demon, and he can't leave until he gets her soul, but she doesn't want to give him her soul. And so there's a lot of forced proximity, like they have to stay near each other, and so their cover story for that becomes that they're dating. So you have the fake dating, you have forced proximity, you have like the witchy, supernatural small town romance. I loved their chemistry in this. I loved her friends. I loved their individual character development journeys and what they discovered about each other and themselves. It had a lot of heart. It had me feeling a lot, and it was also deceptively so much spicier than I was anticipating. But I had a good time. I was kicking my little feet. I had a lot of fun with this one. So, you know, if you're into supernatural romances, if those tropes work for you, I feel like there was more character development here than I'm used to with a lot of romances, and that was great. I had a really great time. I do recommend this one. Okay, up next. I have quite a bit to say about this one. So, I read what was for me a very highly anticipated read, new horror for this year, and that is Camp Damascus by Chuck Tingle. So, important context, I am an autistic lesbian, and this book, the protagonist is also an autistic lesbian. So I found that out and I was like, okay, hello, I have to read that already, just immediately. And it did not disappoint. I really, really loved this book. Rose lives in a small town, I think in like Montana or Nevada or something. It's very rural and it is extremely religious. It's like this very specific sect of Christianity that I think Chuck Tingle just fully made up, and it really controls most of the town. And this church, everyone knows, gets most of its money through its conversion therapy camp, where very wealthy parents send their gay kids to not be gay anymore. Very little of this takes place at the camp, but, you know, obviously, if you're sensitive to that subject matter, probably skip this. It was okay for me. It was really interesting to be in this character's head as she was figuring herself out, figuring her family and the situation and her surroundings out, seeing the little ways that she was discouraged from acknowledging her sexuality. But what I think for me was the most interesting thing about this book was how autistic it was. I was really not anticipating that. You know, based off of the premise, I assumed that it would mostly be about sexuality and the conversion therapy camp. But honestly, it's not as explicit, but I feel like this book is just as much about autism as it is about queerness. Chuck Tingle himself is autistic, which I think is why the autism rep in this worked so well. I don't personally relate to Rose very much. We have very different brands of autism, but I still, like, everything that she said and thought and did still felt very autistic to me. And the most interesting part about it was that, first of all, her family was trying to discourage her autistic traits and habits just as much as they were trying to get rid of her homosexuality. And I don't think that a neurotypical person could have been the hero of this story. I think that this story needed an autistic person to save the day, and that was so, so cool. It was hard in the beginning when it is very much about her having to suppress her homosexuality and her neuroatypicality, but as she progresses through the book, she uses those things to be the hero, and she comes to love herself. She finds people who loves her. I was really surprised that I was so much more affected by her accepting the autistic parts of her than I was her accepting her queerness. And I think that that might just be because I've read a lot more stories about queer people than I have read stories with good autism representation. But it was just such a wonderful experience for me to read a story where the hero is so profoundly autistic, and that part of her is what made her the hero of this story. I thought it was so beautiful. Again, I didn't overly relate to her, but that was okay, you know? Like, all autistic people are very different, so I'm still searching for, you know, really, really connecting to a character on that level. That still hasn't happened for me yet, except maybe Quinny from Heartbreak High is the closest. But regardless, I really recommend this book. I had a few difficulties with it on like a technical level. I thought there were a lot of parts of this book that were solved a bit too easily, which feels weird because I'm not rooting against queer kids, you know what I mean? But it made it a little bit hard to like get into the tension when the problems were solved so easily. But other than that, I really loved this book. I'm so glad that I read it. I will always recommend it. It had great character development. The plot was interesting. The setting was fine. The prose did their job. But if you're looking for some diverse horror, I definitely recommend this one. If you need a good badass autistic hero who saves the day with autism, definitely recommend this. Be prepared for, in the opening stages, you know, some difficult to read suppression of her autistic traits, but it pays off and it became such a powerful arc for me. And I hope that it does for you too, if that's something that you need. I will also say that if you're not autistic, if you don't know a lot about autism, you might read this and be like, what were you even talking about? Because the autism, it does explicitly say that she's autistic, but most of the things that are so autistic about her and the story are implicit. I recognize them because I live them, or because I have autistic friends who share those traits and I see it in them, things like that. So if you're not really familiar with it, you'll probably come out of this with like just the queer side of things, which there's nothing wrong about that. I just wanted to prep you. If you don't know a ton about autism, you might not see it in this because it feels like the autistic parts were written for autistic people. It's not like, read this book if you want to learn about what it's like being autistic. It's like, read this book if you're autistic and you need a hero who happens to be autistic but isn't like, autism's a superpower. We're different, but we're not better or worse. This is just an autistic gal saving the day with her autistic traits in a way that doesn't feel condescending, doesn't feel shoved down your throat. It feels very authentic and very subtle, but still noticeable, certainly to me. I hope that made sense. I had a hard time thinking that through in a linear way, but I hope I got the message across. I really love this. I definitely recommend it. The next book that I read in October was another highly anticipated horror release for me, and that was A Haunting on the Hill by Elizabeth Hand. This is the first addition to The Haunting of Hill House that Shirley Jackson's estate has given the thumbs up to. And that really got to my head. I was like, this has to be fantastic. Haunting of Hill House is one of my favorite books. And I just thought, it must be fantastic. If this is legit, if this was approved by the estate, then it must be wonderful. And I really got my hopes up too high. It was fine. It was fine. You know? It's about a playwright, a singer-songwriter, and two actors who... Luca needs to come in. You wanna sit on my lap? Talk about books? Come talk about books with me. Oh, thank you. Oh, bye. Okay. He's gonna be back there. Doing his own thing. Where was I? So this group are all workshopping a new play together, and so they rent Hill House and stay there on their own, out kind of in the middle of nowhere, to work on this play together and really concentrate. Luca? Hey. You need to come in too, Stinker? Come on. My cats hate the door being closed. Anyway, this book. So they are all out concentrating on this new play and scary stuff happens. There were a few parts that were really cool to me, that were really inventive. There were a lot of things that I've never really seen in haunted houses before, but something about the way it was written just didn't scare me. It didn't feel overly like eerie or like the dread or suspense. None of that really came through for me, and I wasn't overly interested in the characters, and I think that was part of it, was I was just kind of on them. And I was like, okay, I mean, what's gonna happen to you is what's gonna happen to you, I guess. I just had a hard time sinking in and like feeling the stakes and feeling the dread and the fear. That never really happened for me with this book, which is, again, such a bummer. My hopes were for sure too high. It didn't take away from my love for Haunting of Hill House. It was fine. You know, it was fine. The characters are well developed, they just didn't really stick with me personally. The setting was really interesting. She did some really cool stuff with Hill House and, you know, what it's capable of. And it was definitely, you know, vibrant and distinct in there, and I could see and feel all of that, and that was pretty cool. The prose did their job, they weren't distracting. Yeah, it was fine. The last book that I read this month was a surprise hit for me. That was The September House by Carissa Orlando. I believe Jordaline put this on my radar, and I'm so glad she did. I was expecting just like, oh, this will be a nice, pleasant way to pass a few afternoons, you know? I was expecting something kind of light and frothy and just a little spooky and fun. But this actually really went a lot deeper than I was anticipating. So this book is about a woman who lives in this house that is profoundly haunted every September. It's kind of haunted all year round, but then every September stuff really ratchets up. The very interesting thing about this woman is that she's like, I can handle it. I know how to keep these ghosts happy. This is my house. I live here. We live here together. We coexist. Oh yeah, the dead kid's here. I know her. It's fine. But her husband feels the opposite. He's way scared and he left. He was like, I can't live in this house for another September. So he's gone. And their daughter comes around and is like, hey, I haven't seen or heard from Dad in like over a month and you're acting really shady. So I'm gonna stay here and we're gonna find Dad and I'm gonna figure out what's going on with you. So our main character, the mom of this family, this is really following her trying to keep all of the scary stuff in her house away from her daughter, who's staying at the house for the first time. Really trying to keep all the stuff from her and also trying to keep why her dad really left away from her as well. This has been called cozy horror a lot. And I just want to be clear, there's some really horrifying stuff in here. There's a lot of really gory things going on. It gets really deep. Honestly, if I had read the trigger warnings, I don't know if I would have read this book. It turned out fine for me, but you know, there's some scary stuff in this book. And I think the reason it's called cozy horror is because there's such a sense of humor written throughout it. Kind of like T. Kingfisher's writing in The Hollow Places and The Twisted Ones. Like it has that like snarky kind of just humor written throughout. And so I think that's why it's called that. I just wanted to be clear that this is definitely, it was a lot gorier than I was anticipating, but it's very over the top. It's very campy, fun, funny, but also devastating and scary and sad. And it made me think a lot about the psychology of people whose experiences are different from mine. You'll understand what I mean if you read the book. I don't want to get into spoilers, but it really got into a deep psychological place, and it was great. I heard that some people think that it's a bit too repetitive. I didn't have that problem at all. The pacing felt good. I was really interested in the characters. I was really interested in the horrors of the book. The house itself was very, very there for me. Like I felt like I was there in the house with her. I really cared about her and what would happen to her. The stakes were high and I cared about them. I was laughing. I was really feeling and thinking a lot, but it was accessible and it was just a really good time. I liked it so much more than I anticipated. I definitely recommend it. Especially if you're a character and setting horror reader like I am. I had a really good time with it. And it really made me think a lot. Anyway, those are all of the books that I read this October. Feel free to like, subscribe, comment. I would love to hear if you've read any of these books and how you felt about them. Even if you disagree with me, that's all good. We all have different opinions. I would love to hear yours in like a mutually respectful kind of way in the comments. I love talking about books. I hope you had the best Halloween ever if you celebrate, and I'll see you soon. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time. Bye.